Joining us now from Washington, D.C. is Klaus Larres. He's a professor of history and international affairs at the University of North Carolina. Really good to have you back with us, Professor. We know that U.S. lawmakers have received an update, a classified briefing from the Trump administration, and many lawmakers, especially among the Democratic Party's lawmakers, are concerned that the Trump administration may be engaging in a so-called forever war because, according to them, the administration hasn't set out some clear objectives or any sort of an end game. What's your view? What is the Trump administration's plan here?
Yeah, it was about time that they gave a briefing to Congress, because Congress is, of course, in charge really of war and peace, and they should have been informed right at the beginning, but they weren't. Only belatedly, after 4 or 5 days of war, Congress was informed. What is in that classified briefing, we don't know, of course, but I wonder whether the goals have been made clear. And we know that initially President Trump talked about regime change. That seemed to be his major ambition. Now in the last few days, actually, we hear about the nuclear missiles or the nuclear facilities in Iran, which should be eliminated, and the ballistic missiles should be eliminated, and also the ability of Iran to sponsor international terrorism. But regime change doesn't seem to be on the agenda anymore. And of course, regime change would be very difficult. But what it really means that we don't quite know what the Trump administration intends to achieve in Iran. And perhaps that classified briefing made things clearer. But so far, President Trump hasn't addressed the nation. He hasn't told the American people what he actually wants to achieve in Iran. It still is an open question.
We are hearing concerns about so-called boots on the ground, about the US potentially deploying troops to Iran. According to reports, that possibility hasn't been ruled out by the Trump administration. Historically, how do conflicts like these escalate from air and missile campaigns to a ground invasion?
Well, I'm very doubtful that the Trump administration really wants to admit ground troops to Iran, because the bad example is, of course, the Iraq war, also the Afghanistan war, where American troops were involved on the ground for many, many years with many casualties. And in the end, they didn't really achieve very much. And Trump rightly fears that that would be the case in Iran as well. And he wants to avoid these so-called forever wars. And by not committing ground troops, the likelihood of not being dragged into a war which lasts for many weeks and months is much higher. On the other hand, how do you want to change a regime without ground troops on the ground, without troops? Is it possible to change a regime just by airstrikes? So far in history, that has really never been the case. The Trump administration seems to hope that a popular uprising in Iran will occur, and that popular uprising will do the job for them and get rid of the current regime and what is left of the regime. That, I think, is a very optimistic hope. And even if that was the case, even if there were a popular uprising, how would a new government be found and be formed among all of these people? Hundreds, thousands of people taking to the streets. How can a new government be formed? So I think, we really need more clarity from the Trump administration, what they really want to do.
Some Republicans are invoking the so-called America First doctrine. Indeed, Donald Trump on the campaign trail had advocated for this, and a part of that doctrine, as we know, is for the US not to be involved in conflicts outside of the country. Does this war represent a break from that promise, or can it still be framed within that mantra?
Well, that is what the Trump administration tries to sell to us, like a defensive war, like an imminent attack from Iran was forthcoming on the United States. But all that is highly implausible, to be honest. I think it is a typical war, as many of Trump's predecessors had got into. And it is an unpopular war already. More than or almost 60% of the American population seem to be opposed to the war. war. Only 27% really approve of it. And in particular, the core of his supporters, the so-called MAGA movement, they are less impressed or very much unimpressed by Trump's involvement in that war in Iran. And of course, the European allies are supportive rhetorically, but in reality, they're very concerned about the new war in the Middle East. Refugees will show up on Europe's doorsteps. Then, of course, attacks on European countries and European bases may happen, as we saw already with the British base on Cyprus. And so the Europeans would love to see that war finished as soon as possible. But no one really dares to tell Trump in two open words, because Trump is very powerful. He has a lot of leverage over Europe regarding the Ukraine war, for example, or America's nuclear umbrella for Europe. And all these things, I think, mean that there's very little pressure from the Europeans on Trump, while domestic pressure on Trump to not get involved in that war in any length of time is probably only gradually building up. It will take another few weeks before that pressure will be so strong that Trump may have second thoughts.
Democratic lawmakers argue that there is no clear exit strategy. Looking back at the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, how important is it for the Trump administration, or indeed any administration, to define objectives and an endgame early on?
It would be important, and I think particularly the American nation, the American Congress would like to know what are the end goals, when can these be achieved. If you don't know what the objectives are, you of course don't know when these objectives have been fulfilled. And that, I think, is the dilemma right now. And people are justifiably asking the Trump administration what they actually want to achieve in Iran. And even afterwards, once these objectives, which we hopefully will hear about soon, once they have been achieved, what is the aftermath for Iran? How will chaos be avoided? How will a wave of refugees be avoided? How is the stability supposed to return to Iran? All these questions have not yet been answered. And one wonders how many plans have actually been drawn up in the White House. For example, the Trump administration seems to have been utterly surprised that thousands and thousands of American citizens are stranded in the Middle East now, including people who live there, but also many tourists who were vacationing in Middle Eastern countries. And the Trump administration seems to have been utterly surprised that there is a closure of airports and the closure of airspace, and that these American citizens are unable to return home. And I think that, of course, should have been in the planning, and the Trump administration should not have been surprised by that. If they were surprised about the details such as that, relatively unimportant details compared with warfare, I wonder how good are the plans regarding actually fighting the war and planning for the aftermath of war.
We're seeing Gulf nations bearing the brunt of Iranian retaliation. How could this conflict impact their security calculations, and in particular their strategic ties with Washington? Do you think this might prompt the leadership in some of those Gulf states to reassess their partnership with the United States?
Well, the Iranian calculation is by putting so much military and economic pressure on the Gulf states that the Gulf states will eventually go to Washington and say, here, we've had enough, you need to do something about it. Also, the world economic consequences of Iranian pressure and military attacks on the Gulf states will be disastrous. So there will be a lot of pressure on Trump, both from the Gulf states itself and from the world economy and the disruption of the world economy and the energy markets and the stock markets, that Iran clearly hopes that Trump will really look for a different way and stop bombarding and allow the surviving regime members to continue their role in Iraq. And I don't know whether that calculation is right. I think right now the Gulf states seem to be quite annoyed about Iran. They have no intention to give in and to put pressure on Trump. But of course, if that conflict lasts for much longer, then that could change. Also, Iran has probably calculated that it simply needs to survive. It needs to continue the process for any length of time then the Gulf states, the United States, domestic opinion, also the Europeans, they will all tire of the war and will try to find a way out and leave the Iranian regime survive and leave them in power. And that calculation is probably something we cannot dismiss easily, but we have to see how the next few weeks play out and whether or not, particularly the Trump administration and the Israeli government, which is of course a very strong partner for the United States in the war in Iran, how both of them will continue to view the situation and how they can withstand domestic and international pressure.
Looking at the broader sweep of US foreign policy history, does this conflict risk becoming another so-called forever war, or are there factors that make this situation fundamentally different?
It could. There is a possibility that we will be dragged into a war which we cannot control anymore, which will go on forever. On the other hand, ground troops have not been deployed and probably are unlikely to be deployed. And I think to stop aircraft from bombarding a country is a lot easier than to withdraw ground troops to close bases like in Afghanistan, which led to a very difficult situation when the military base in Afghanistan was closed by the United States. So I think as long as ground troops are not being deployed, there is a likelihood that the Trump administration can actually finish the war within a reasonable period of time, whatever that means. It probably will be a few weeks, but not years and years. So I'm optimistic that the Trump administration will not want to be dragged into a prolonged war. And we have to remember the MAGA movement, Trump's core voting potential, they will be increasingly opposed to the war over time. They are already, as I said, they are already quite strongly opposed to the war, and that will only continue and increase. And there is the midterm election in November, though November is a long time away. But the Trump administration will have to keep that in mind, not to annoy its voters too much, 9 months or so before the next important election in the United States. So all these factors taken together, I would say, will probably prevent that the United States will again be dragged into a never-ending war.
There appears to have been confusion over whether the US acted independently or in response to Israel's plans. How damaging are contradictory public justifications when building domestic and international support for war?
Yeah, there are reports in the American media that both Israel, Prime Minister Netanyahu, and the Saudi Arabian Crown Prince have persuaded Trump to get involved in that war in Iran, and that Trump himself was emboldened by the success of the American attacks and kidnapping on Venezuela, and also before that on Iran in June of last year. It is difficult to know how true these stories are. And today there also is even a report that the Iranian assassination attempts on Trump in 2024, that convinced Trump from a personal point of view to actually go against Khamenei and get him first before Khamenei was able to get him. How true that really is very difficult to evaluate. But it doesn't look good in the American media, of course. You know, your president being dragged into war by outside countries, that never goes down very well. And I think the Trump administration will, of course, reject that, but they have to do a good job to convince the American public that there was a good reason to go into the war in Iran, that they have very good objectives they want to achieve, and that they will control the aftermath rather than letting chaos and forever war run wild.
Okay, Professor Klaus Larres, we'll leave it there for now. Great to get your analysis as always. Thank you.